It's my privilege to chair this session, and the first speaker is Michael Tribe, who retired actually a couple of years ago, but from this department, but he has been quite active. He has written a number of books, and his latest book is on industrialization with John Weiss. We also use his book in as a textbook for research method in our courses. He's going to speak on international aid in Tanzanian development. I don't know what to do to wake you all up, but it is that time of day. But Mike probably will find something.
If you promise to stay awake, we'll give you a drink afterwards.
Yeah, but it is good that I have three colleagues from my department who's presenting. I can see our students are excited sitting there. So we start with Mike. Mike, you have 20 minutes for your presentation.
Good afternoon. The first thing I should say is that I feel a little bit out of place in the sense that I'm not really a Tanzanian specialist at all. Although Andrew Colson remembers East African Social Science conferences from the late 60s and early 70s, at which we both have been present when I was at Makerere. The second thing is that the title is perhaps in some ways not terribly indicative of the content, but I had to have a title and I thought that one looked all right. So please don't criticize me for having a content which is not directly related to the title. I'm starting off, there is a paper developing which is not yet finished, but I'm starting off with a selection of statistics, and I'm making this comparative with data from Tanzania, Ghana, and Uganda, most of it drawn from World Development Indicators and from OECD sources, although there are one or two other sources which have been used as well, mainly over the period 1980 to 2012. Most of you will know that World Development Indicators only started in 1960, so you can't get data before 1960 from World Development Indicators. And actually quite a lot of the data series don't go back before 1980 anyway. So that period is quite a lengthy period to have a look at. Secondly, we're reflecting the structure of the paper, which will come in the end, is a selection of some issues which arise in some ways from the data relating from the statistics, which are not only on aid. And then third is some early sort of issues, plus some things from my recollections, relating specifically to Tanzania. And I'm in the process of doing what amounts to a literature review on publications relating to Tanzanian aid. I've got I think about a quarter of the way through the documentation that I've identified on that. The OECD DAC statistics have these basic figures, and these show very clearly that Tanzania has been receiving in recent years significantly more aid than Ghana or Uganda. Ghana and Uganda I'm much more familiar with. We have a very high share of bilateral aid in total ODA. If you look at the ODA to gross national income ratio, it's about twice as high in recent years for Tanzania and Uganda, somewhere around about 10%, than it is for Ghana, where it's around about 5% of GNI. It's quite a significant proportion. And the GNI per capita is significantly higher for Ghana than it is for Tanzania and Uganda. If we look at the major donors of ODA, again from OECD sources, for Tanzania, Ghana, and Uganda, there's quite a number which are common, and the United States is at the top of the list pretty well if you look across taken as a whole. The IDA, the International Development Association, follows fairly closely behind, and the UK is a significant donor. But for the 10 most significant donors, there's a lot of commonality between the three countries. This, frustratingly, is in bar diagram form and is the ODA by sector in percentage terms. And it shows that there's quite significant differences between Tanzania, Ghana and Uganda. Uganda and Tanzania are much closer together, and the health and population, the brown colour, is a lion's share for those two countries. But in Ghana, the sectoral share is much more even. I've got some more detailed data which will be in the paper when it's ready. I've presented a summary of some of the data here. And if we take ODA as a percentage of GNI, which you've already seen for recent years, but here we're comparing the figures for 1990 and 2011, and we can see that for Tanzania, the proportion of GNI contributed by ODA has dropped by about 2/3 over this 20-year period. For Ghana, it's dropped by about half, and for Uganda, it's dropped by about 50%. But the ODA as a percentage of GNI has been declining in all three countries. If we take ODA as a percentage of government expenditure, and this figure did somewhat surprise me, and it may surprise you, for Ghana and Uganda, the statistics are from World Development Indicators. So for Ghana in 2001, ODA contributed nearly 65% of government expenditure. For Uganda, about the same. And for Tanzania, we have a figure taken from the 2004-05 budget, where it amounted to nearly 80% of government expenditure. The explanation for this, of course, is that the government expenditure is total, and that includes both capital and recurrent expenditure. So the aid contribution to capital expenditure would be very high, much higher than the contribution to recurrent expenditure. But again, these figures have been changing. So just over this 10-year period, for Tanzania, dropped by about 8%. For Ghana, the contribution to government expenditure has dropped very significantly, and for Uganda, it's dropped a bit. The third column was actually prompted by a presentation I heard from a DFID professional some few months ago. And it was not ODA per capita, but ODA per capita of those in poverty below the standard level of $1.25 a day. And this is 2011 US dollars. It's a figure for 2011. I was surprised how difficult it was to actually arrive at these figures. I couldn't find a source where I could just download figures of ODA per poor person, where a poor person was on this international standard definition. So I had to do some calculations which involved not only trying to get constant price series, but also to get the number of people rather than the percentage of the population below the poverty line. And so I ended up with these figures. And what they show is that over the period, it's 2011 dollars, so it's constant dollars, but it's for years 1992 and a year as close as possible the same, around 2007, 2006, 2009. And what we can see is that aid seems to be a little bit more focused in terms of the level of poverty. That is to say that the amount of aid per head of the poor has gone up. I'll come back to the Tanzanian case in a few minutes, because that echoes some of the points that were made in earlier sessions today. The next slide is to do with GDP growth. And we have all the normal reservations about statistics, of course. But if we take constant price growth, over the period from 1990 to 2012, Tanzania's average GDP growth for that period was 5.24%, which is really quite significant. So the GDP in 2012 was 3.34 times that of 1988 in real terms. Ghana's average growth over the same period was 5.55%, so that had grown by 3.62 times between 1988 and 2012. And Uganda's average GDP growth from 1990 to 2012 was 6.81, which meant that the GDP in 2012 was 4.81 times that of the 1988. Really quite substantial growth. And of course, in the case of Ghana, there was recovery from a period of significant economic mismanagement, which went from the mid-1970s to the mid-1980s, and there's been sustained growth since then. And in the case of Uganda, there was much more than serious mismanagement. There was the conflict, which included, of course, the war with Tanzania and the ousting of President Amin. But from 1990, there's been a sustained high rate of economic growth. And one of the problems in this context, I'll come back to that in a later slide briefly, is of course that a lot of the work done, economic work done on the relationship between aid and economic growth is very controversial and comes to all sorts of different types of conclusions. But the most recent work tends to suggest that aid is positively associated with economic growth, not very strongly, but significantly. And so that tends to contradict the conclusions of people like William Easterly, who's an aid skeptic, and of course it also contradicts the rather more harem-scarum ideas of Dambisa Moyo. Okay. If we look at the poverty headcount, one of the difficulties, of course, is that this data for the poverty headcount, that is the percentage of the population below $1.25 per day, this is done in different years for different countries because it's all linked to the living standards surveys, which are supported by the World Bank. Now, if you look at Tanzania, for 1992, the poverty headcount was just under 73%, and in 2007, it was about 68%. For Ghana, in 1992, it was just over 50%, but it dropped to just under 30% in 2006. And for Uganda, it was about 70% in 1992 and had dropped to 38% in 2009. If we look at the whole series of figures, which are, as I say, for scattered years, it does look as though Tanzania has got stuck, as it were, in terms of the poverty headcount, whereas Ghana and Uganda have shown substantial progress in reducing the extent of extreme poverty. But I'm sure that there are other people who are more, have more information on that sort of issue. But that's what the figures seem to be indicating. If we look at the other side of the equation, the Human Development Index, which is the positive side, then we can see that Tanzania, Ghana and Uganda have all three seen what we could see as some kind of progress over the 22 years from 1990 to 2012. So for all of them, the HDI index number has improved. Standard of living has improved according to that measure. And although their ranking in the international rank ordering is very low. This slide shows a sort of netting out of a variety of different figures for around about 2012. I have to be a little bit vague about that because all the figures are not for exactly the same year. What you'll see there is we have a figure for Tanzania, Ghana, and Uganda, which you've seen earlier for net ODA inflows. It is actually difficult to find private NGO inflows by recipient country. I spent a long time looking for this. It's easy to get NGO outflows from donor countries. If you want to know how much NGOs contribute from the UK, you can find that comparatively easily. But if you want to find out how much Tanzania benefits from NGO inflows, it's very difficult. And I'm still looking. There's a new source which has just very recently become available called dportal.org, which I found out about from Development Initiatives, the Development Initiatives newsletter. And that has quite a bit more data, but it still involves a bit of manipulating to arrive at some sorts of conclusions. I could, though, find figures for the contribution by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, because those figures are quite easily available on the OECD website. There's also remittances. Personal remittances have been increasing, and you can see that particularly in the case of Uganda, the recorded statistics are significantly high. They're what is that about a third, or more than a third, 35% of the ODA inflows. So remittances are quite significant in the case of Uganda. Why they're lower in the case of Tanzania and Ghana is unclear. We also have illicit flows. There's data available on illicit flows. And the source that I've used is Global Financial Integrity, which was mentioned earlier on. But the particular table in the most recent report covering 5 countries, which I was referring to, seemed to have some inconsistencies in it, and they haven't yet replied to my questions about it, so I shall try again. But we have some data now on illicit flows, and what that suggests is that in the case of Tanzania, the illicit flows actually favour Tanzania to the extent of about $200 million. And they are against Uganda to the extent of about $800 million. But I think that again is something where I'll need to follow it up. But for completeness, this is quite useful. Okay, so we've got 3 economies which show quite significant economic growth over quite a long period. A long way away from the characterization of Dambisa Moyo as aid contributing to the collapse of African economies. We've seen Tanzania receive substantial amounts of ODA through this period, and in the case of Ghana and Uganda, substantial amounts of ODA, particularly following the re-establishment of what we might think of as stable governance in the 1980s. And as far as I know, there's been no individual country studies about the contribution of ODA to economic growth or poverty reduction in general for any of these 3 economies. ODA has been running at a significant proportion of GDP, a significant proportion of foreign exchange receipts over this period. And one question that we might well ask in terms of thinking about the contribution of ODA to the economy or to poverty reduction, which doesn't really get included in the cross-country studies, is really what is the counterfactual? What would have happened in the absence of aid? In terms of the macroeconomic impact of that we've seen, that must be quite significant, and I think we must judge that aid has had a positive impact in the case of all 3 countries. I've introduced, is Michael Lofty? Yes. You'll be pleased to see that I've got Dutch disease in here as an issue. And so with the amount of aid, the amount relative to total foreign exchange earnings, we must expect that there is this question about the role of Dutch disease in the economies. Right. So we have 3 points here in sort of concluding. One is the issue of budget support. In the UK, budget support is being downgraded, but in terms of the Paris Declaration and in terms of the interests of recipient countries, budget support is important. Public expenditure management, there's quite significant efforts being made in Tanzania to improve that, and that also comes under the Paris Declaration. To what extent has there been compliance with the principles of the Paris Declaration? Generally speaking, the donor countries have not been as impressive in their performance on this than the recipient countries. And I've also sort of thinking about the question of corruption. One issue with corruption, which hasn't been mentioned yet, is the relative significance of the internal and external contributions to corruption. In other words, there are international dimensions of this, and this was very, very clear in the context of the air traffic control issue in Tanzania, although that was not actually aid-related directly. The government of Tanzania has an assistance strategy. You can download it from the Ministry of Finance website. And this was started in the early 2000s, before the Paris Declaration came in 2005. So in that sense, they're ahead of the game. And if you get your hands on the presentation, you'll find that there's quite a significant bibliography at the end, but there'll be a bigger one later.
Thank you, Mark.
Thanks.
What I want to have a look at is the whole issue. A lot of what I'm going to say kind of relates to what Mike's been saying in relation to aid, and I've actually deleted, at least I think I've deleted, a couple of slides that were more or less kind of saying the same thing. So I will start off. I'm looking at the whole issue of development and inequality and how it affects a number of countries. Unlike Mike, who said he hasn't completed the paper, and unlike Kifle and myself, who have completed the paper, in this case the paper isn't actually started. Basically, one thing to point out is the renewed optimism. Suddenly people are getting optimistic about Africa. They're saying, they're noticing finally that there is economic growth going on in Africa, which has actually been happening since the mid-1990s. But it takes quite a lot of people a bit of a while to wake up to the fact that it's happening. So now we are getting more optimistic, and we're thinking in terms of African lions, like the Asian tigers. But we have to ask a couple of questions. One question which I didn't really address, or won't really address to some extent in this presentation, because Mike's covered a bit of it, relates to aid dependency. In general, the countries I'm looking at which include two of the countries that Mike was looking at, have reduced their aid dependency to some extent over the period I'm looking at. And mineral dependency, which of course is relevant to Tanzania and Ghana, which appear in both my sample and Mike's sample. But what I'm more interested in is who gets the benefits. Do the poor benefit from growth, or does it all go to rich elites? So I'm looking at 4 countries: Tanzania, Ethiopia, Ghana and Mozambique. Similar kind of size of economies, some similar historical background in terms of state-led development. You could talk about charismatic leaders like in Nyerere, obviously, in Tanzania, but also in Nkrumah in Ghana and Samora Machel in Mozambique. Followed by liberalisation, usually under pressure from the World Bank and the IMF. All 4 previously dependent on export crops, but in the process of diversifying. And the next paper, which Kifle and I will be dealing with, looks at some of those issues. All 4 have average growth rate over the last 25 years of 5 to 7%. So there's the picture. You can see The green one is Ghana. Obviously, as Mike showed before, Ghana is higher per capita income than Tanzania. Tanzania and Mozambique are fairly similar. Mozambique seeming to catch up a little bit. Ethiopia, poorer, but achieving quite significant growth in recent years. And what I've tried to do is use the World Development Indicators data to work out where the growth goes. So if we look at Tanzania, overall in the period that I've looked at, in the case of Tanzania, 1992 to 2007, GDP per capita has increased by 2.3%. But if you look at who got the 2.3%, the rate of growth of incomes of the top 10% was 3%, but the rate of growth of the incomes of the bottom 10% was 1.8%. So clearly, a higher proportion of the growth is going to the richer part of the population. Even more so in Ghana, if we look at Ghana's GDP per capita growing at about 2%, for the top 10% it's growing at 3%, but for the bottom 10% it's only growing at 0.1%, virtually no growth in income at all. So in the case of Ghana, you've got very unequal income growth. Mozambique is quite interesting. It has relatively high rate of economic growth in the period that I've looked at, 5% for overall GDP per capita, but higher for the top 10%, lowest for the bottom 10%, but not such a big difference as in either Tanzania or Ghana. And the interesting case is Ethiopia, where we've seen what we might call pro-poor growth. We've seen growth of about 4.1% over the period I looked at, and the rate of growth of the incomes of the top 10% has been actually lower than for the bottom 40% and lower than the bottom 10%, but the bottom 10% haven't done as well as the bottom 40%, so that it's not quite as pro-poor as perhaps one would want to see. So what I also looked at was the ratio of the incomes of the top 10% to the bottom 10%, and how that changed over the period. So Tanzania has become more unequal, but it was the least unequal country at the beginning period. Ethiopia was the third most unequal country, the second most unequal or the third equal, depending on which way you look at it, and is now, according to these figures, the least unequal country. Ghana has obviously increased substantially, but one of the factors in Mozambique, although it's seen quite a big increase in income of the poorest of the population, it started off with a very, very unequal distribution of income, and it's even more unequal now. So although the poor are gaining, Mozambique is still a very unequal place. So we've seen that growth is most unequal in Ghana. Tanzanian growth is less unequal. Growth in Mozambique is less unequal, but started from a position of extreme inequality. And Ethiopia has experienced pro-poor growth, with the income share of the bottom 10% increasing. So then I had a look and calculated a Kuznets ratio. The reason Mike's already explained why the data don't necessarily fit all the same period. It's because you can't get figures for every year on the distribution of income in the population. So you have to have certain years. And you can see the Kuznets ratio, which is the higher that is, the more unequal a country is. Mozambique is the most unequal, but the most recent figures suggest that that's declining a bit. Tanzania, income seems to be increasing, inequality seems to be increasing, not that fast. Ghana, income inequality is increasing, but a slightly slower rate more recently. Ethiopia, income inequality was falling, but now it seems that it's beginning to increase again. How reliable these figures are, of course, is open to question. We've already had, this morning, various comments about the unreliability of statistics, so there's a big health warning on that. So why are these differences happening? Well, some possible explanations. One, the argument that agricultural growth is more pro-poor. The majority of poor people are in the rural areas. The majority of people in the rural areas rely on agriculture for a livelihood. Therefore, to the extent that there is growth in the agricultural sector, then that is more likely to reduce inequality, whereas growth in other sectors might increase it. Mineral export revenues, maybe they don't trickle down, so I wanted to have a look at mineral export revenues, see if they had anything to say. Government expenditure on education and health, we might say perhaps that's pro-poor because it improves the health status of the poor and it improves literacy and so forth that allow people to improve their standard of living. And then the initial level of inequality, maybe that's got some explanation as well. So the share of agriculture, we can see that the most pro-poor growth we have is in Ethiopia, and Ethiopia has the largest proportion of its GDP in the agricultural sector. So that seems to me to suggest that there is some connection between agricultural growth and pro-poor growth. Most of the countries have seen some decline in the share of agriculture in GDP. If you remember this morning when Brian was saying about the fact that actually 4% growth in agriculture is pretty good because of the nature of agriculture, if you've got a rapidly growing economy, it's almost certainly going to be the case that the relative importance of agriculture will go down. And that's perhaps one factor that might tend to lead to, if you like, greater inequality. We can see that these figures suggest here that that the share of agriculture is going down, which we would expect, but it's going down at different rates in different countries. So, recently it's increased in Ethiopia, perhaps that's one factor. It's lowest in Ghana, maybe that's one factor why Ghana has relatively if there's such a word as unpro-poor growth, growth that is not pro-poor. The higher the share of agriculture, the greater the share of growth that goes to the poorest 40%. But all four countries are urbanizing, and if we look at that, you can see that I was quite surprised when I found out that actually now more than half of the population of Ghana live in urban areas. And of course, in all of the countries we've looked at, that is happening. So what we know is that there is going to be, if you like, a higher proportion of the poor population as time goes on are going to be living in the urban areas. And we have to think of that as an important issue. I looked at mineral and fuel exports as a percentage of the total exports, and it's sort of up and down. Relatively unimportant in Ethiopia, quite important in Mozambique, but also important in Ghana. Ghana, we can see towards the end, Ghana is increasing quite significantly. We know that's been happening. And of course, it's become, from a period when it was relatively unimportant in Tanzania, it's now becoming quite important. So there is a question, where does that mineral growth go? Mineral rents as a percentage of GDP, which don't completely match the mineral exports. The interesting thing there to me is that the two countries that have had the most unequal growth, namely Ghana and Tanzania, are the two countries that have got the highest mineral rents. So maybe that suggests that the mineral rents are not being used to, if you like, relieve the poverty of the mass of the population. So, does poverty impact depend on what mineral rents are spent on? I don't know the answer to that. I'm not sure whether I'm going to find the answer to that. but that's a question that we might want to raise. Also, does expenditure on education and health make a difference? Well, what we can see is that all of the countries I've looked at have generally tended to have an increase of the proportion of public expenditure going on health and education as a percentage of GDP. But Ghana has had a kind of a dip and then started going up again. So we can't really, perhaps we can in relation to Ghana, but otherwise I don't think we can really use expenditure on health and education as any particular indicator why one country should have more pro-poor or less pro-poor growth. No obvious association. Initial level of inequality at the starting point, different for different countries, but Tanzania had the least unequal distribution, Mozambique the most unequal. Ethiopia had the least unequal at the end point, but Mozambique still the most unequal, although there is significant growth of the poorest. So to conclude, what we've seen is that the African lions have experienced quite significant growth over a prolonged period. In most cases, this growth has benefited the poor, but the extent to which the poor have gained varies from one country to another. And that, I think, is an important question for us to ask, because we know in Africa, or many African countries, economic growth is happening. And if we are concerned about poverty reduction, we have to think quite carefully, what sort of growth is it that gives poverty reduction? And the final point there, agricultural growth appears to be pro-poor, but all countries are urbanising. So does this mean that we are going to have increasing inequality because of urbanisation, or does it mean that we have to think about how we deal, we have to think much more about how we deal with the issue of urban poverty? Am I on time?
Yes.
Okay.
Done. Yeah, that
Good.
was good.
Yeah.
I'm impressed. Thank you very much. The third speaker.
The third speaker, just for the beginning. No, I'm Kerry.
Are you
This is
presenting?
we are both presenting. I'm doing the easy bit, and Kifle is doing the difficult bit.
And who's starting first?
I start. I do the easy bit,
Yeah.
and then I go away and leave all the difficult bit to Kifle.
That will save time. Go on.
All right, I'll give one of them to him.
Right? Yeah. Can you give one of them to him, and then we'll. Where's that? Seamless. Have we got your? It's there. This is a topic that we were both interested in, and so we wanted to investigate the impact of real exchange rate changes on export performance in Tanzania and Ethiopia. Obviously, I'm interested in Tanzania from my kind of because I spent quite a long time in Tanzania. Kifle is interested in Ethiopia because he's Ethiopian. If we look at, he's interested in lots more things than just Ethiopia. We've seen growth, we've seen that in the previous slides. Exports have grown faster, but fastest in Tanzania. That is faster than Ethiopia in Tanzania. Both countries are more open to trade than they were before, but Tanzania is more open to trade than it was more open at the beginning of the period and is still more open at the end of the period than Ethiopia. Both countries have reduced trade barriers, again, more so in Tanzania. Both countries have devalued, again, more so in Tanzania. So the question we're asking is, do policy differences help explain the export performance? And in particular, does changes in the real exchange rate have anything to say? And the figures we've got here, these are the easy statistics, so that's why I'm talking about it. The more difficult stuff is for Kifle because he does the complicated bit. If we look at the growth rates in real GDP over the period that we've got reasonable data for, more or less the same. Ethiopia is slightly faster than Tanzania, but growth in real exports is 8% in Ethiopia, but nearly 11% in Tanzania. So Tanzanian exports have been grown faster, but in each case, exports have grown faster than GDP, and that suggests a priori that exports is part of the, if you like, the generation of growth rather than the other way around. Exports as a percentage of GDP, they've increased in both countries quite significantly. Exports as a percentage of imports has increased quite significantly in Tanzania, but actually in the period we're looking at has actually declined in Ethiopia. Openness to trade, we can see that's increased in both countries, higher in Tanzania, and the nominal exchange rate has devalued a lot, but if you like, it's sort of just over 8 times in Ethiopia, whereas in Tanzania it's about nearly 16 times, so more devaluation. So what we're looking at is the real exchange rate issue, and for those of you who are not economists, essentially the real exchange rate measures the extent to which changes in relative prices are reflected in the exchange rate. And most economists agree that an overvalued exchange rate has a negative effect on export performance. But one of the questions we're looking at, and Kifle will explain that bit, does an undervalued exchange rate improve export performance? And what are the costs, potential costs of undervaluation? And that's the point at which I say I come. It's your turn.
Thank you. I will present the summary of the empirical findings. I will not go into the technical details of how we arrived in some of the conclusions that I will present later. We used a 30-year data from both countries, and our aim is to first assess to what extent the trade and exchange rate policies these countries implemented had an impact or contributed to the observed export performance. In order to link the various policies to the export performance, we used real exchange rate as a proxy to capture the degree of external competitiveness of the economy. Therefore, we did two things. One, we assessed to what extent the export performance of these two countries is associated with real exchange rate movement of these countries. Second, we try to assess, especially test the emerging view that undervaluation of real exchange rate is useful for export performance. We wanted to test that, if this actually holds in the two countries. Focusing on the effect of real exchange rate movement on on export performance, we postulated different empirical models, especially linking the real exchange rate with the export supply and export diversification indicators. In order to do that, we used GMM and panel data, other panel data models. And the findings generally indicate that depreciation of the real exchange rate significantly increased the manufacturing share of export. We used the share of manufacturing export as indicator of vertical diversification of export. And the result consistently showed that depreciation of the real exchange rate increased the manufacturing share of export. We also used the Hirschman indicator to measure the export diversification, and based on that indicator variable, we again found the consistent result that depreciation in real exchange rate is significantly associated with horizontal diversification. The other issue we are interested to see is whether the real exchange rate has boosted the traditional export. Therefore, we linked the real exchange rate and export supply of traditional crops, as well as the export share of GDP as an indicator. In general, the result shows that a 1% depreciation in real exchange rate has increased the share of export to GDP by 0.37%, which is relatively high. We also aggregated the volume of traditional export and estimated another model, another export supply model. And the result again showed that there is a significant association between real exchange rate movement and supply of traditional export. The other key policy findings of our result is that export performance is adversely influenced by increasing government consumption. We have also, in order to see if the level of aggregation, when we control the level of aggregation, if the result also changes, we estimated the same function at the product level. And we used cotton, cashew nuts, and tobacco, and coffee and tea. We estimated their supply function, where we introduced real exchange rate as one variable. And the result generally confirmed that real exchange rate movement has a significant impact on traditional export items. Therefore, in general, regarding the impact of real exchange rate movement on export supply and diversification shows that although its impact varies by type of product, in general, export supply in these countries has responded to the level of incentive created by various trade and exchange rate policies. And the second conclusion is that a country that maintains a competitive exchange rate policy performed better in terms of export growth. The second issue we wanted to address, we want to test, in fact, as you know, there is emerging view that, which is contrary to the Washington consensus, that deliberate undervaluation is essential, is desirable for export growth. We wanted to test whether this actually holds in the case of Tanzania and Ethiopia. In order to do that, we had to estimate an equilibrium real exchange rate and determine whether the observed exchange rate is above its equilibrium level. Equilibrium level, we mean that the real exchange rate that ensures sustainability of the trade balance for the sustainable level of capital flows. Based on our model, this is the trend we get regarding the association between the real and the equilibrium exchange rate. As you could see from the figure, both countries were able to maintain a competitive real exchange rate level, and the observed is closely related to the expected or the equilibrium level. But as you could see from the figure, in the case of Tanzania, it consistently maintained an undervalued exchange rate compared to the Ethiopian case. Therefore, based on the deviation between the observed and the predicted real exchange rate, we re-estimated the various supply and export diversification function. And the results generally suggest that the share of export to GDP is generally higher during periods of undervaluation. And a 1% undervaluation is associated with 0.5% increase in export to GDP ratio with a 1 period lag. Again, also varies by crop. On average, the export volume of traditional crops is 50% higher in period of undervaluation. But our empirical result shows that there is no significant association between undervaluation and diversification. Okay, the general conclusion we can draw from this result is that maintaining a real exchange rate that is close to its equilibrium is necessary, but maintaining an undervalued currency increases export more. And as you saw from the graph, the key difference between the two countries is in terms of their exchange rate policy. Tanzania maintained an undervalued real exchange rate for a long time and performed better in all forms of indicators. But the achievement is not without cost. Tanzania is able to achieve higher export growth at a price of high domestic inflation. And through accumulation of reserve, Tanzania was able to maintain an undervalued real exchange rate, and it is questionable how sustainable it will be, because it will also have an impact on future growth through domestic saving and investment. This is an issue that we want to pursue further. Ethiopia seemed to have contained inflation. Inflation were relatively low before 2008, and it maintained a real overvaluation by building large current account deficit. It's not like the case of Tanzania. Therefore, the question is, what is the net welfare effect of an undervalued real exchange rate? The welfare effect depends on the balance between the welfare loss as a result of inflation and the welfare gain as a result of an expansion of the tradable sector. The key policy issue is here is that who gains and who lose from this policy in the case of Tanzania. Especially those that are consuming the tradable goods will suffer. And those that are engaged in non-tradable sector will suffer. But we cannot reach on that conclusion unless we supported our conclusion with further empirical analysis. Therefore, assessing the net welfare effect of real exchange rate undervaluation, focusing particularly on its distributional implication, could be a very fruitful area of future research. Thank you. If you are interested, for those of you, we can provide the technical paper, the detailed findings. Anyway, thank you.
Basically, their most dramatic shift in policy, and it was really dramatic, in 89 and 93, was a time when what aid they had been receiving, a lot of it from the USSR, collapsed. And in fact, they had very little aid at all. And then they became very successful, and aid donors jumped on the bandwagon, hoping to imply that their aid was the cause of the evident performance, which was far from clear. But secondly, because the Vietnamese were tough characters, basically, I think basically the donors had almost no effect on policy. I did an evaluation, which I pulled out of eventually, for the donors of the effect of general budget support. And I became totally convinced it had no effect whatsoever on policy. The Vietnamese were totally ruthless. They sent very junior officers along to negotiation who just present very bland and banal reports on what was happening, and they didn't move an inch on any policy. In Tanzania, in contrast, although there's this fine declaration 2005, an input into the Paris Declaration, when I did an evaluation of the support for poverty reduction programs for the Danes, it became quite obvious to me that whole process was dominated by donors. That in fact the Tanzanian government had very little impact. And so in fact, what the donors saw themselves as doing was through general budget support, buying influence on policy. There's no question about this when you see the whole mechanism. Despite the fact that when the BRICS launched the general budget support idea in Ethiopia, actually, at the donors meeting I was at, the argument that donors were going to get out of the kitchen and stop interfering, the reverse happened. Under general budget support, they got incredibly involved in all sorts of detailed issues of the structure of the budget and other aspects of policy making. Whether they were really effective, again, is a very difficult thing to tease out. But in practice, certainly, the objective in that whole period is, having got out of project funding, was in fact to try and have a pervasive influence on government policy making. Now, then the question comes, was that a good thing or not? And that's even more difficult to decide, because you then have to decide whether, on balance, donors have more sense than the government.
Thank you. There, back.
Hi, thank you. A question sequentially, first from Michael. I think we'd all at this point, in light of the observations that Kifle and David made about exchange rates, is it possible to expand further the application of the concept of Dutch disease to Tanzania? And is it possible to know whether aid inflows have contributed to exchange rates whose RERs would not be where they are, but for the hard currency inflows supplied by the aid community? And is it possible sequentially that this helps to account for uneven performance in the traditional export sector of Tanzania? Perhaps Kifle and David could also join that conversation about aid inflows and Dutch disease. Second question really follows on the question that Brian just raised about inequality, and this is for David's paper. Is it possible to regress the Kuznets ratio against growth rates? In other words, is there some ideal level of inequality Is this a Goldilocks kind of a thing? Too little inequality would stifle growth because there would not be adequate incentives for entrepreneurship and risk. Too much inequality would stifle growth because you'd have a too low purchasing power and a social demoralization. Is there some Goldilocks idea going on here where, as far as inequality is concerned, you want not too much, not too little, just the right amount?
Okay, do you want? Let me take an illustration.
Is it right? I'm just going to get my paper from my briefcase.
Okay, no, okay.
Yeah, thank you so much. Just two points. One is with respect to pro-poor. David was talking about pro-poor expenditures, and you make reference to health, education, and probably agriculture. To link with Mark's paper, that I think in terms of the sectoral distribution of aid, I think infrastructure has received a fairly substantive amount, and to the extent that that is opening up rural areas for sort of economic opportunity, will that be classified also as a pro-poor or not? The second issue is with respect to direct foreign investment, that at least for Tanzania after liberalisation, we are also noting a fairly substantive flows of direct foreign investment. Now, I was just wondering to what extent that also has contributed to the exchange methods of the exchange direction, so to speak. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. We have three pertinent questions, and who's going to start first? Mike, you want to start first?
Yeah. On Brian's question, there is a difficulty when you're sitting in a study in a Glasgow flat, and you have access to the internet, or you can go into libraries and check on things, on looking at documents and actually working out what's happening on the ground. And so in terms of the donor position in the aid context, it's difficult to read from the documentation. What you can actually see is that I think there were 10 or 12 donors signed up to the Tanzanian assistance strategy in, I think it's 2006. But the most recent reports following up on donor compliance with the Paris Declaration suggests that only really about 5 or 6 of them are responding to the questionnaires and requests for interviews. And so from that, it's difficult. Well, what it suggests is that there's a difference between signing up to a document, probably with a great fanfare, and what actually happens on the ground, which is what one would expect. There's some documents which I haven't yet managed to read, which I think are sort of ex post evaluation of GBS, general budget support in the Tanzanian context. So I'm sort of being a bit evasive, but I think I think your line makes a lot of sense. There's a logic in it. On the issue of Dutch disease, I haven't tried to get into that significantly. I'm not aware of any studies. I know that for Uganda, David Kihangiri raised that issue, did he not, in his PhD?
More to do with the effect of unstable exchange rates,
Right.
really, rather than...
Okay. But so it's something which people have been concerned about, but I'm not up to speed on it at the moment.
Okay. David?
Okay, on the point that Brian raised in relation to poverty and inequality, I take the point that you make, that poverty reduction and reduction of inequality are not the same thing. However, I would say that both are important. or let's say extreme inequality is a problem, both perhaps on a moral basis, but also in terms of the way, if we look at, for example, at Tanzania, one of the great things about Tanzania is it's been remarkably stable, and people, by and large, have not been killing each other. And arguably, one of the reasons why people in Tanzania don't kill each other is because it is not a grotesquely, it is an unequal society, but it isn't a grotesquely unequal society. And I think that does matter. So, yes, you can have growth with inequality, and if you have complete equality, probably you won't have as an incentive. So somewhere in between is somewhere that you've got to choose. Obviously, growth is important, but I would argue that maintaining a reasonable level of equality is also important for a decent society. That's a kind of a, if one believes in the difference between kind of a normative and an objective statement, that's a normative statement. On the Dutch disease effect of aid, I don't think we know really, but I suspect that there must be evidence in Tanzania that at certain stages, especially when Tanzania was maintaining a very heavily overvalued exchange rate, that probably that was allowed, if you like, that couldn't have happened without aid, and therefore we might say that that was could be something like a Dutch disease effect. I think perhaps it's not perhaps a particularly important issue at the moment, but Kifle might have.
Yeah. I'll comment on that. Especially, I want to use. Okay. Although we did not directly address the issue of Dutch disease, but we know that one of the channels by which aid generates or affects the economy through its influence on the real exchange rate. When we estimate the equilibrium exchange rate, we postulated a GMA model, and one of the variables we have included as the explanatory variable is the log net official flows. And as you could see, the findings is contrary to what we get from the literature. Normally, it is assumed that aid flow appreciates the real exchange rate. But this is not the case. In the case of Tanzania, according to our findings. In fact, aid lead to a depreciation in the real exchange rate. Our finding is similar to the research conducted by IMF, I think in 2005, 2007. They came up with similar findings that aid and foreign direct investment inflow in Tanzania actually depreciated the real exchange rate. And a number of explanations have been provided for such unusual findings. For instance, the aid inflow might have been increasing the productivity of, if it is directed to increase the productivity of non-tradable sector, its impact on the real exchange rate will be the opposite. The other explanation given to this finding is that the aid flow, especially which is targeted in the infrastructure investment, is increasing overall productivity of the economy, in which case it boosts supply more than the demand response it will generate. The other explanation given for this unusual finding is that aid might be targeted in a sense that the aid provider give aid on condition that the recipient imported goods, tradable goods from the donor. In that case, its impact on real exchange rate will be quite different. Thank you.
Just make one quick point, sir.
Yes, no, go on.
Just a very simple point. Depending on what years you take, in Tanzania, there's an issue of which direction the causation was. It's rather clearly at a certain point, the expansion of aid went along with the reduction of the real exchange rate and was responding to what the donors considered to be an improvement in policy. But that depends which years you took at this. That was certainly true, say, from 85 to 95, not afterwards.
Yeah, I think that's true. It's quite clear effect of the donor agencies in terms of policies during that period. So I think that point is taken. There was another question. Is it possible to regress, I think this was Mike's question, regressing Kuznets ratio against inequality? The problem with that is the data limits, because your measures of inequality come, I've got on my graphs maybe maximum of 4 observations in any of the countries that I've looked at. They come like every 5 years or something like that. And so really performing any kind of regression on that is not going to be very easy unless you invent the points between the 5-year points and assume that it's a straight line, which is, of dubious, let's say, a dubious methodology at any rate. The infrastructure point, I think obviously you could argue that investment in infrastructure is pro-poor. You might think about which bits of infrastructure are pro-poor, though. Obviously, you would say that basic water supplies, in principle, should be pro-poor. You would probably say that rural feeder roads are pro-poor, that improving communications in low-income urban areas are pro-poor, but some other aspects of infrastructure are probably not. But haven't really tested that one, so I can't really make any judgments.
Have you responded to Joe's question?
The infrastructure thing.
Yes.
The influence of foreign investment on.
I think that was for Mike, wasn't it? That was for Mike.
Yeah.
Sure.
Was it?
I think he mentioned that.
Yeah.
He responded in a way.
It means the result the result generally suggests that be in form of foreign direct investment or in the form of aid, according to the result, it does not generate an appreciation of the real exchange rate. Rather, it creates a depreciation in the real exchange rate.
But I thought that it was more the DFI, the direct investment, rather than the aid that has been more or less at high cost, because of course it's very rapid rise, and therefore for that years maybe that is a bit more than the aid. That's what I was interested. Was there control for DFI?
Well.
But we shall discuss.
Yeah, I think you can discuss it later on.
Yeah,
Okay. Mike wants to say something briefly, very briefly, Mike, because I just want, there's one more question and then I'll end it.
This is the evidence that there's a paper coming. But one of the tables, I've taken data for exports of goods and services, imports of goods and services, and then I've taken the imports minus exports as a percentage of imports. You with me? And if we take just 2012, for Tanzania, that was nearly 33%. For Ghana, it was nearly 24%, but that had come down quite significantly from the early 2000s. And in the case of Uganda, it was about 38%. So that the trade and goods and services deficit is really pretty big. I don't know what we would expect, but that's the gap to be filled in terms of foreign exchange.
Thanks. I just want to end because, but we have a student who should really ask a question. Go on. That's the last one.
I am a student in BCIT. Name is Sopo. I have two short questions, very general question. The first question for Michael, Dr. Michael. Could you show me the table of his PowerPoint?
Which table?
PowerPoint. I don't remember. The Uganda, Tanzania, you compared to the Ghana.
Okay, ask
Which
your question. Right. Yeah.
Which one?
Yeah.
Tell me
next
one.
one. Yeah, that one.
That
Before.
one.
Yeah.
Before.
That one?
Sorry. Next one. Next one. Yeah. I have a question. Why is the illicit flow is the Tanzania is plus 216, but Uganda is minus 700, almost 800 is the.
Yes.
Could you explain about the reason why is the two countries?
Okay.
Is big gap.
It's a very good question, and it's the question that I was asking global financial integrity. I was explaining earlier, I saw a newspaper article in The Guardian about 3 weeks ago referring to a global financial integrity report. And so rather than taking The Guardian's report of the report, I went to the report. So I went to the GFI website and downloaded the report. And they have a summary table for a 5-country study. And the figures just simply didn't make sense to me. They had positive and negative in places where it didn't look as though they should have had positive and negative. So what I did was I reorganized the figures to try to make sense of what they seemed to be saying, and this is what came out. And so I've sent it to them and asked them if they could comment on it, because it seemed to me that in the original table they were double counting. So they were adding up everything and saying this is the impact of illicit flows on the balance of payments. And so they were, in a sense, adding positive and negative figures and coming to an even bigger figure. So anyway, it's work in progress. So you need go to the GFI website. There's a new report, and have a look at it because it's got individual country studies on Tanzania, Ghana, and Uganda, and 2 other countries. And so you can have a look at that, and it may answer your question.
Yeah, thanks.
But just on the same,
On the same question.
just
Okay.
on the same point, I mean, it is counterintuitive. I mean, Lawrence was pointing out that there are all sorts of ways that money is taken out illegally through transfer pricing and other arrangements.
Yes.
There are all sorts of rumours of people stashing up large sums of money, and some of them quite well founded in Swiss and other bank accounts.
Yes.
If the other side of it, there are also rumours on the street that the building boom in Dar es Salaam is funded by money laundering from the Middle East.
Well, this is
and it may be that is the case, and that there are some amazing illegal inflows. I would have to be convinced.
Yes.
I also would say that the remittances figures there are equally improbable. I mean, I was at a meeting of an organisation that works with the diaspora in this country, of people from African origin living in this country not long ago. And the view there was that because the Ghanaian community and the Nigerian community, but especially the Ghanaian community, is one of the biggest in this country, their level of remittances is therefore huge. And there are really only a few Tanzanians living in this country, and therefore that's why the level of remittances is much less, and that is not reflected there at all. So the understanding of the diaspora community in that meeting was that Ghana is a really big funder a supporter of the Ghanaian economy through remittances. And if any Ghanaians here, I'm sure they'd have things to say about it. So I think you have to be so careful with some of these figures and some of the aid figures as well. Just to throw out one thing, some measures of aid include debt write-off.
These do.
There's an extraordinary book called,
yes.
And some don't. This extraordinary book called Toxic Aid has no figures for multilateral aid, quite detailed figures for bilateral aid. The bilateral aid figures show enormous changes in the donors, with the USAID coming from nowhere to being hugely the biggest aid donor. And then what are the implications of that? So loads of things I could say.
Well, I can add another book by Easterly, just published, The Tyranny of Experts. It just came out.
Yeah. So, can I say that the personal remittances figure here is taken directly, I think it's from World Development Indicators. So if we don't believe World Development Indicators, we don't believe them, but there must be some explanation. The illicit flows are mainly associated with mispricing, over-invoicing and under-invoicing. So that's that. There's no actual, I don't think they've included any illegal flows, money laundering or things of that sort, which is a different issue altogether.
It does include that. The GFI figures include organised crime and that kind of
Do they?
Right, can you ask your second question? Quick, yeah, because we are running out.
My second question for David Paul. Could you show me his output?
Asking difficult questions. Go on.
My point is he compared to Ghana and Mozambique get income growth part.
Hang on, where are we? What are we looking for?
So you mean the development and equality in some African alliance?
Yeah. What do you will want to?
Yeah, table.
That table, okay.
Yeah, before, maybe after.
This one?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Go on then.
Next, I think next one. Another table. Previous.
A previous one. Oh, there might not be a previous one. Oh, hang on.
There's
okay. Okay, yeah. Yeah.
Why is Mozambique is bottom of 10% people? They are very quickly is growth, and then why is the Ghana people is not quickly growth? But yeah, so I want to know that because of this table.
Right. I'm not sure that I've got as far as having a definitive explanation. I'm trying to suggest possible reasons, and one of the possible reasons could be to do with the relative importance of agriculture in different countries and the rate of growth of the agricultural sector. So if we look at share of agriculture in GDP, we see that in Mozambique, during this period, it's stayed fairly flat, so it hasn't changed very much, whereas overall, in most countries, the share of agriculture is going down. So possibly that's one reason why, although Mozambique is, in absolute terms, pretty unequal, that even so, the rate of income of the poorest people, assuming, there's an assumption there that the poorest people live in the rural areas. Now that depends to some extent on where the poor are, and that partly depends on the level of urbanisation. And we can see that if we've got Mozambique here, it's not urbanising as fast as some of the other countries. So maybe that has some explanation. There isn't a model here. I'm not sure that I'm going to produce a model because I'm not quite sure what the model would be if I produced it. all I'm trying to do is to tease out some possible explanations as to why growth is more pro-poor in some places than it is in others.
Okay.
But it's
thank
not
you very
proven.
much. Thank you very much. I think it is time to go and drink and large, probably brandy or whatever. But